Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones answering your questions tonight. Star of stage and screen, Miriam Margolyes. The Assistant Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg. The Editor of Mamamia, Jamila Rizvi. CIS Policy Analyst, Trisha, and the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, author and economist, Andrew Leigh. Please welcome our panel. Thank you, and you can join the Twitter conversation, and if you'd like to send us a live question, add @Quanda to help us find it among the many thousands of other ones. Well, our Facebook followers asked us to discuss inequality, and the first question comes from Ray Litting.
We were told that as the economy grew, wealth would trickle down, but it seems that the wealth is actually trickling up, so that the richest 1% now own 48% of global wealth. How can this trend be reversed?
Trisha.
I would always be sceptical of putting too much weight in figures like that. I'm not sure, do you know where that figure comes from?
Credit Suisse.
Oh, well, that's interesting. I would always think that what I'm more concerned about is less who has what and whether or not people can move up the economic ladder to get more. And so I think when we have a consensus in this country, and I'm sure Andrew and Josh will both agree, that we no longer talk about equality of outcome in this country, we talk about equality of opportunity. And I think the debate to be had is over what kind of policies create the best opportunities for everyone. And I think Andrew and Josh will take a bit of a different take on that, but I think that's really what we should be talking about, not necessarily outcomes, but opportunities.
Let me ask you this, what do you think drives equality of opportunity?
I think the key driver of equality of opportunity is, for starters, a free market, one where people can contribute as workers, contribute as business people. I can see you're sceptical, sorry. But I think that's one of the key drivers of economic growth. The other thing is, I think, education, basic right to education. Choice in education, I think, is important. One of the policies I would really like to see is more school choice, especially for people in public schools where currently they don't have a great deal of choice. If you don't have money to go to a Catholic school or a private school, you don't have a great deal of choice. And we know that having choice in education is one of the key drivers of success.
Let's go back to our questioner, Ray. What do you think about... you were obviously looking rather sceptical at the answers you were hearing at the beginning.
Well, I don't think that the market is going to solve all our problems, and I don't really think I'm talking only about this country. I think it will take more than the market to create any sort of equality. OK,
let's hear from the rest of our panels. Jamila, what do you think about the idea that the richest 1% are in possession of 48% of the global wealth?
Well, I think inequality contributes to a worse society, absolutely, but it also contributes to a worse economy. An economy that is strong and thriving is one where there are successful and strong businesses, absolutely, but also strong consumers and consumers with power. If you can imagine an economy where there's 100 businesses and one person with not much money to buy things, that doesn't work so well. One of the biggest strong economic drivers in China over the past 20 years has been the rise of the lower and the middle classes, and having more money and having a more equal society has actually led to a stronger economy as well. So I think the two are interlinked.
So in China, it's very equal if you're in the Politburo and less equal if you're not.
Yeah, I'm not saying we should be China.
What's such a high percentage of
billionaires? If we were going to compare China today to 30 years ago,
yes,
I think we're still in a better position than we were 30 years ago.
Josh Frydenberg.
Well, it's funny because this argument about growing inequality has found one supporter in an unusual source, namely Rupert Murdoch, because he's talked about quantitative easing, which has been the printing of money essentially throughout the world, as driving investments into equities in the stock market and other forms of assets that wealthy people can access. So he's actually been one of those people who've been out there saying government policies has actually driven greater disparities in wealth. I think if we turn to Australia, the story is a good one. In fact, Credit Suisse, who you just named, said that Australia has the highest median wealth of any country in the world. And if you look at our tax system and our transfer system, our welfare payment system, it is very progressive. so that the top 20% of income earners only derive 1% of their income from the government, whereas the bottom 20% of income earners derive 55% of their income for the government. And when you look at the top 2% of tax payers, they contribute 26% of the overall tax take, whereas 45% of Australians who put in a tax return only contribute 4% of the overall tax take. Now, those statistics are really interesting. I'm not saying people at the lower incomes deserve any less, of course not, because to your point, we need to help them get the education, get the health, get the opportunity for them to rise up. But I think in Australia, it's a pretty good story to tell, Tony.
Well, let's see if Andrew Leigh agrees. We might have a debate here. Go ahead.
Well, Ray, I think it's a terrific question to ask, because it's not just an economic one. It goes to who we are as a nation. Ours is a nation where we're happy to sit in the front seat of taxis. We don't much like tipping. We don't have private areas in the beaches. And there's another country that's had former bankers called Nugget and Nobby. I'd like to hear about it. The stories that came out after Tom Uren passed away were the stories of how in the prisoner of war camps, Australians acted differently from the British and the Americans. They shared what they had, and they had higher survival rates as a result. We've now got the highest inequality we've had in 75 years. The top 1% share has doubled, the top 0.1% share has tripled. We've got a doubling in the number of private planes in Australia, and yet 1 in 7 Australians can't afford dental insurance. And so I think we're running a risk at the moment that great egalitarian tradition in which we prefer to use the word mate to the word sir, and we'd never think about reintroducing knights and dames, is at odds with the economic reality, with the fact that we've really seen this rising gap between rich and poor. And I think other panellists have talked about some of those important ways of redressing the gap. A means-tested social safety net, as Josh says, is really fundamental to the Australian story. But you cut against that if you have a parental leave scheme that gives more to those at the top. And education's really vital, as Trisha's highlighted. But there's a real risk if you cut away on supports to the kids in the most vulnerable schools. Some of the poorest schools in my electorate had literacy and numeracy coaches under the previous government. Those have been taken away, and I worry that those children aren't getting the educational supports that'll really help to close the gap.
Andrew, I've got to ask you the obvious question. If you believe that Australia is at its highest point of inequality, at least in recent history, is the Labor Party prepared to use a tax system to redistribute income and to change that?
Well, Tony, we did this in government. If you look at the period from 2007 to 2013, it's striking that inequality actually didn't go up in that period. One of the reasons for that's the biggest increase in the pension in 100 years, which took a fifth of the people out of poverty, took 1 million pensioners out of poverty. And at the same time, we made decisions, for example, on superannuation, to cut superannuation taxes at the bottom, and yes, to raise them a little at the top for people with 2 million in their superannuation.
Yeah, but the question
tax.
is, it really goes to the massive deficit Australia is facing now that the Labor government never planned for. And the big question is, how are you going to pay for all your promises in the future? How are you going to create equity in the future without raising taxes?
Well, I stood next to Chris Bowen and Bill Shorten today announcing in the first half of this parliamentary term a costed Labor policy to crack down on multinational tax avoidance. It's pretty rare for a...
Also, it's not very much money either. It's $1.9 billion over 3 years, and there's a huge deficit vastly beyond that. You're going to have to do much more than that. And you're going to have to do things ultimately which impact on Australian voters, not multinational companies.
Well, Tony, let's be clear. This raises twice as much as the government's GP tax would have raised. So we're not talking about a trivial amount of revenue here. It's an important policy measure, but we'll have more conversations about how to ensure we have a sustainable social safety net
and
a fair tax system.
I'm
very happy to go to any of those details. Fire away.
Okay.
Because that's fundamentally...
OK, let's fire away. Will you put up taxes on the highest income earners and their superannuation? Will you get rid of negative gearing? Will you change capital gains tax laws? Will you do those things which people have pointed to, which create intergenerational inequity?
Tony, we've said we're open to a range of conversations, as you'd expect us to be. We're a party that is deeply concerned about inequality, and we rolled out today a carefully costed policy. You couldn't imagine oppositions over the last 6 years coming to the people in the first half of the parliamentary term with a policy that's been carefully costed, where we've spoken to experts, grounded in the OECD work, and made sure we're not hurting the research.
Well, we didn't talk about that one. You said you were going to talk about all these other things, but actually you just slipped away from that discussion.
Tony,
Well, I'm certainly happy to make sure that we have fair superannuation tax concessions. One of the measures that the Coalition didn't proceed with was a measure which saw people with more than $2 million in their superannuation accounts pay a little more tax. And we chose that point,
They get to pay
Tony.
a lot more tax, aren't they, to pay for your promises?
Well, let's go through policy by policy, but I'm explaining this one to you. We chose that point because those people...
There's a voice in my ear saying, let's not, and probably I should listen to that. Let's go to Josh Frydenberg just to answer some of those questions. I want to hear from Miriam too on this question about inequity. So we'll start with Miriam and come back to Josh.
Well, firstly...
Oh, well, we'll start with Josh. Come back to
Be quiet.
Miriam.
No, of course you've got to tax people. And I don't understand why people are so frightened of being taxed. People like me, who earn more than most others, we've got to pay taxes. I'm on your side. I vote for you. But I want to see a bit more courage and spunk from you. And the reason why why money is not trickling down, Ray, is because we live in a capitalist system and capital accrues. And that's why, and it may not be palatable to everybody, but that is the reason. And so you have to fight that by stringent taxes. I'm prepared to pay. I have never denied paying taxes. I've never avoided taxes. I don't go in for any of those schemes. We have to, if you earn, you've got to pay. And that keeps Australia nice and clean and healthy and gives people decent education. And that's what you've got to do. Put up the taxes.
OK, Josh. Keep it brief, but since I raised all those issues with Andrew, not that we got a lot of detail out of them, I mean, it's no secret, actually, some of your colleagues in the ministry would like to see changes to negative gearing. Appreciate there may have to be changes to capital gains tax, that there may have to be higher taxes on the richest people's superannuation. Do you agree with all those prospects?
Well, we are having a tax white paper process, and that's going to look at some of these issues that you raise, and it'll be open for discussion. But the point about Andrew's, $1.9 billion revenue-raising initiative that he put to the Parliament today after doing nothing for 6 years in government is that they're now blocking $30 billion worth of savings in the Senate. So you're right, it's just 6% of what they're blocking in the Senate. But you put your finger, Tony, on a critically important issue when we're talking about fairness, and that's the intergenerational point. We didn't create this debt and deficit legacy. Labor left it to us. And so, therefore, it's our job to try to pay that back. Well, that's the reality. And so, therefore, when we're paying it back, we have to think, if we don't pay it back, what does it actually mean for the children who are just young now, who will be entering the workforce in a few years' time? And that number is enormous. And we absolutely have to bear that in mind when we go about this issue of budget repair.
OK, we've actually got a question relating to the intergenerational issue. It's from Aaron Miller. We'll go to Aaron Miller.
Hi, my question's to the panel. Do you believe it's fair that younger Australians who are struggling to afford a home, while wealthy retirees are living in multi-million-dollar homes and claiming a pension? I'm not saying that these pensioners should have to leave their homes, but why should I be effectively subsidising somebody else's inheritance when, instead of claiming a pension, they could reverse mortgage their home?
Let's start with Trisha.
Aaron, that's a great question. I'm really glad you asked it. In short, I agree with you completely. I think one of the primary reasons why the family home has been exempt from the income and the assets test for the age pension thus far is because it's viewed as a vehicle for saving. But what's the point of saving if you're not intending on drawing down on that saving in retirement? And so there are options such as the reverse mortgage option, which essentially allows people to unlock equity in their own home. Doesn't mean they have to leave. It allows them to use their asset more productively, and it means that they aren't that the taxpayer isn't subsidising their children's inheritance. I think this is one issue that the government should look at very strongly, and I would urge both Josh and Andrew to think about it.
OK, we've heard from the policy analysts. What about the politicians? Andrew Leigh, you're sitting next to her, so what do you say?
Well, first of all, Aaron, I think you've hit on what is a vital issue in the Australian community. For the first time in a long time, we've seen home ownership rates for young Australians starting to fall. And that means that many Australians are locked out of what has always been regarded as a normal part of the Australian dream. I understand, though, that taking away or including the family home in the assets test for the pension does risk damaging community. For somebody who's lived in a suburb for all of their life, whose friends and neighbours are around them, that sense of place is really important to who they are. But there's other ways of tackling, I think, the same problem that you're talking about. The ACT, where I'm from, has put in place a reform to move away from stamp duty, which is a real discouragement to people downsizing. We also in government looked at ways of encouraging people to downsize by allowing the equity in the family home to be treated, to essentially be exempted from the assets test, while allowing that person to sell the home to make a bigger house available to someone else where they wanted to. But it's going to be a really big conversation in the Australian community, because the doubling of house prices over the course of the noughties is in some sense the biggest intergenerational transfer of wealth we've seen in Australia in a very long time.
Now, how do you propose to solve it then? Because all these young people out there who can't get into the market would quite like to know before they vote for you.
Well, part of it, Tony, goes to housing supply. I think a big part of the solution there is making sure you've got policies that encourage infill. I was really troubled when Barry O'Farrell got to office and cancelled a plan which would have allowed higher density housing along the North Shore train stations just because of local electoral politics. That's the sort of policy that you want if you're going to boost housing supply.
But then Labor-held seats in the inner west of Sydney, for example, have exactly the same policies. They stand against development in inner west areas that are just as close to the city in terms of public transport distance as the suburbs you're discussing.
And this is why I think we need to tackle this at a higher level. And there's a role for a state and potentially even a federal government to ensure that there's the supply of housing that people want. Huge demand for apartments now. And so we've got to make sure that supply comes on. The National Rental Affordability Scheme that we put in place in the global financial crisis didn't just support a whole lot of building jobs, it also added to the housing stock. So it paid a double dividend during the downturn.
I'll just hear from Josh Frydenberg on this, and actually go to the question that was originally asked, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, actually, Andrew and I see eye to eye on this issue, in the sense that I think it is very tricky to go and take away a senior person's home when you haven't actually gone to an election and sought that particular mandate. So we have no plans to do that. But on the issue of affordability... The questioner
suggested reverse mortgage as a possibility, as a way of dealing with that problem.
And they're very interesting discussions to have. And in fact, I'm meeting with people later in the week to discuss their thoughts on that particular issue. But land release is important. But to go with land release is also infrastructure. And I think we haven't done that well enough across this country, Labor and Liberal, in having a cities policy and understanding about the projects that you need in terms of infrastructure, whether it's public transport, whether it's road, to actually give people greater accessibility from new property developments. And I think that's something we can all do a bit better.
Jamila.
I think the family home holds such an iconic status in sort of the Australian psyche that I imagine it will be quite a brave government that goes there in terms of this policy area. Not in my lifetime. waiting. It'll come. But for me, I mean, I'm in a similar position to Aaron, and I'm 29, and I look at the situation I'm in and my partner's in, and we're very well off, and we still go, how the hell are we ever going to buy a house? Entering the housing market is just something that I think for young people is starting to move further and further and further away, to the point where a lot of my friends and family, it's just not on the table. It's not something they're thinking about till their 40s anymore.
Well, we were talking about intergenerational inequity, and of course, if you were of the generation that had a cheap house that became a very expensive house, you now have the equity to buy investment properties. And of course, that's what's happening. Most of the properties now are being bought by investors in this huge boom at the moment. Do you think something should be done about that?
Yeah, absolutely I do. And I also think another question here is around superannuation when we're talking about inequality. The Keating government made huge investments to incentivise superannuation and create a culture of super savings. Now that we're starting to see that better entrenched in the Australian community, there's got to be a point where we start having a conversation where we say, if you are retiring with $2, $3, $4, $50 million in superannuation, should you be able to get the tax concessions you're currently able to get? Or should you be paying tax when you're over 60 like the rest of us?
Well, Josh, you'll just say there's a tax review coming up and you'll dodge that question, no doubt. But what do you actually think, personally?
Well, I do think there are real issues to look at in relation to superannuation because a lot of people have used it for more than just retirement incomes. And, you know, one of the...
Encouraged by the former Liberal government, no doubt,
well,
when they built the tax concessions in the first place.
But also when you've got compulsory super today at 9.5%, building to 12%, a legacy of the Keating government. I'm happy to say I think that was a very good move because it set Australia up where I think we're fourth in the world in terms of the amount of funds we have under management, $1.9 trillion in terms of superannuation. One of the things that David Murray did in his financial systems inquiry is he pointed out some of the problems with the superannuation sector, and particularly in terms of the leverage that people are doing inside their own self-managed super funds. And he raised the particular issues around that because if people start borrowing against their life savings, what happens then if something goes bust, if we have another global financial crisis? So David Murray has put a lot of these interesting thoughts on the table. We're going to formally respond to that report, Tony, but I do think there are issues for governments of both political persuasions to look at.
And it's okay, though, from your point of view, if they borrow against their very expensive houses, which have grown in value, as you said, enormously, and use a tax subsidy called negative gearing to buy more houses?
Well, negative gearing, that is not a black or white issue, because one of the positives about negative gearing is that because people are getting a tax deduction on their investment, their actual rents that they can charge can be lower than otherwise would be the case. So people say it actually boosts housing affordability in some sectors. So these are shades of grey, Tony.
Miriam, listening to this, you obviously lived in several countries, and I'm just wondering, is it done better in other places? I mean, the housing affordability crisis is also huge in Britain.
Absolutely. Young people can't afford to get started on the property ladder. And I think, I didn't know about this reverse mortgage idea. I think it's excellent. Get on with it.
Well, I don't think you could really improve on that answer. We've got someone with a hand up there, but let's go to our next question first of all. It's from Candice Lester.
Andrew, you've said, and I want to quote you on this one, the ideal Medicare model involves a small co-payment, that Australian universities should be free to set fees according to the market value of their degrees, that large government handouts impose suffering and exclusion on those very people in need of assistance, and that regarding pension ages, 70 is the new 64. You've said all this, however, you and your party are still voting against the very government proposals that address these concerns. Would you say you've sold your soul, or simply changed your mind? And if you've changed your mind, then why?
Candice, that's a great question. So
It is. It is a good question.
But there's more to your answer, no doubt.
Thought I might just stop there. Because it goes to the question of when you want your parliamentarians to shift their view and when you don't want it. The classic quote in this, of course, is Keynes. When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? But you don't want a politician that chops and changes their mind due to the electoral wind. So let me take the example of the GP tax. I had a roundtable with a group of GPs in my electorate office the other day, with each of them telling pretty powerful stories about the impact that deterring someone from primary health care has on the system. And they say that when someone comes in for a primary health care check, they can often discover something more serious at an earlier stage. So I've changed the view that I had when I was back as a student. And I think that a GP tax is a bad idea, as I think the government does, although given that it's only Monday, they might change by later in the week. It's important, I think, to make sure that we have targeted government spending. I'm no apologist for the fact that governments have need to raise taxation dollars carefully and need to spend them wisely. That's a progressive economic view of the world. And we also need to make sure that in the area of pension sustainability, that we're not penalising the most vulnerable while letting the most affluent get away with making no contribution. In a stage where we know that the poor live 6 fewer years than the rich, it's worrying to me that the government is saying that the system most accessed by the rich, that is superannuation, that those tax concessions shouldn't be touched, but that the system accessed by the poor, that is the pension, well, access to that should be pushed further and further out of reach. And for those at the bottom, they're often doing manual jobs that are hard on their bodies. So for most of us on the panel, I'm sure we will work comfortably into our 70s.
So you won't be arguing to them that 70 is the new 64.
It is certainly true that that health standards have improved. Not only have we got one of the longest life expectancies in the world, but if you look at people at any given age, Tony, if you ask certain mobility questions, can you climb a set of stairs, do a crossword puzzle, people can do things at an older age that they could only previously do at a younger age. But we need to have a fair approach to this system. And what Labor said in office was if you're getting a super tax concession that's bigger than the full rate pension, then maybe it's time for you to make a little bit more of a contribution.
Andrew, I'm just going to go back to our questioner because she was raising a quizzical eyebrow as you were talking.
I guess I want you to expand on your response. You know, these are kind of 4 topical issues that affect a lot of Australians. You've now come over and you're supporting the coalition, I guess. Are you likely to change your mind on those issues again before the next election?
Candice, my view is that you should assess the evidence as it comes in. And my view on a range of topics has evolved since I was a university student. And I think you'd be kind of worried if I'd been in politics for 5 years, met thousands of voters, and that those conversations, those really human conversations, a bit like those that my grandfather used to have when he was a Methodist minister with parishioners, hadn't shifted my mind on some issues. But what I haven't done is gone to an election saying I would do one thing and then done something else.
Okay, well,
that's fundamentally different from having your views evolve through the course of your life.
Let's go to Josh Frydenberg, and well, I think you did suggest there wouldn't be any new taxes or levies, and of course the GP co-payment was going to be one of them, but you now have the virtue of dropping it so you can keep the promise after all.
Well, you know, Andrew was a big supporter of the GP co-payment when he was an independent thinker and economist. And
yes, but so were you last week, and so I guess the question is, will you still support it tomorrow?
Well,
you don't know because the Cabinet hasn't told you.
That's true. There were a lot of lessons learnt out of the first budget. I mean, there's no beating around the bush on that one.
So can I just say your strongest bet is that the GP co-payment will be dropped, or value signal or price signal or whatever you want to call it?
Well, my strongest bet is what I said on the weekend when I was asked exactly the same question. I said there will be a significant change to our health policy in that respect. But we learned from the last budget that a major change like that, believing as we did we needed a price signal, believing that the sustainability of Medicare was in question because 10 years ago it cost $8 billion, today it's $19 billion, in 10 years' time it's $34 billion, and that we only get half of that $20 billion it is today from the Medicare levy. So we're actually not funding Medicare
So a very
properly.
quick answer on this. What convinced the government you should drop it?
Well, there wasn't the public support for it, and particularly in the Senate.
Okay.
And I think that's a very telling lesson.
Okay.
No, the Senate is a reality. That's the problem.
Senate is a reality, there's no question about that. Now, Q&A is live across Australia, simulcast on ABC 24, News Radio and Australia Plus. And just a pointer for our News 24 viewers, from next week, the national simulcast of Q&A will be replaced by Lateline. So if you live outside the Southeast Australian time zone and you want to be part of the live Q&A experience, next week you'll need to watch on iView. That'll be set up for you. Please keep an eye on the Q&A and iView websites for more details on how to do that. Our next question comes from Lachlan McCarroll.
In light of Senator George Brandis being censured today in the Senate for his comments about Gillian Triggs, even as Tony Abbott sustained the attack on Triggs in the lower house, who's the better Human Rights Commissioner, Gillian Triggs or Tim Wilson?
Let's Let's say the attacks on Gillian Triggs were essentially attacks on a well-credentialed woman. Let's hear from our female panellists first. Jamila, Rizvi.
Well, look, I thought the attacks by Brandis in Senate estimates on Gillian Triggs were quite simply outrageous. She is a public servant. She was appearing at estimates where the minister is supposed to be, in a sense, protecting the public servants from the questions from other senators. He didn't do that. I think he put her in a very uncomfortable position where she was unable to defend herself. I also think that's been the campaign that's been mounted against her in the press by the coalition and also by some high-profile right-wing commentators like Piers Ackerman, who brought the way she raised her own daughter into the debate, which I thought was disgusting, has really... looking back on the last couple of weeks of politics in that space is not only demoralising, but we've completely missed the whole point of her report, which was supposed to be about children in detention.
Trisha.
Yeah, I have to say that I mostly agree with Jamila in that I think that the attack on Gillian Triggs has taken the focus away from, the issue of children in detention. But I do also wonder that this attack on Gillian Triggs and the fact that Labor has then been able to position itself as somehow the guardian of Professor Triggs has meant that, again, Labor also gets to basically absolve itself, and the coalition too for that matter, of the findings of the report on children in detention, which were bipartisan in their criticism of government policy. Although I do wonder that perhaps defenders of Professor Triggs would be better off, I think, spending their energies, perhaps putting pressure on the government to release the Moss report on child sexual abuse in detention, rather than, I suppose, getting into what does Tony Abbott call it, the Canberra insider gossip or something? Because I think the Beltway, because I think this government versus Gillian Triggs or whatever it is definitely an example of Canberra insider nonsense.
Miriam, Margolyes.
I don't really know a lot about this issue, but I don't think that George Brandis, who in many ways is a good bloke, despite being of the wrong party, I don't think he should have made that attack in the way that he did. This is a political attack, and it's about children in detention. The Liberal Party got rid of a lot of children in detention, but they keep them there longer. That is the fact. And I think he should apologise. It was a bad mistake.
Josh Frydenberg.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? George Brandis said that Gillian Triggs is a decent person and a distinguished lawyer. Malcolm Turnbull said exactly the same thing, and as George Brandis said, his comments were seen as a character assassination and Malcolm Turnbull's was seen as a chivalrous defence of Gillian Triggs. Now, we have to ask a bigger question here, Tony. How did the Human Rights Commissioner lose the confidence of the government? And it's the real serious question, because in her testimony in November of last year, she said that she, as early as 2012, realised that there needed to be an inquiry into children in detention. But she waited till after the election in 2013 to actually produce this report. And the facts, as Malcolm Turnbull said on this show just recently, tell a very important story. Children in detention, and for me, one child in detention is too many, reached up to 2,000 under Labor. Today we have 112 children in detention on the mainland and 114 at Manus. Now that's too many.
Actually, Nauru, not Manus. But
so Nauru. We have 114 on Nauru. Sorry?
How many are there at Manus?
Well,
there are none. There are no children.
We've got 114 on Nauru and 112
and
here on the mainland.
how long have they been there?
And some have been there for some time.
Yep.
And and the report actually makes the case that this hurts the mental health of the children. And so that's why we've got to get them out as fast as possible. And we have reduced that number by 90% from what we inherited.
But why, can I just ask Josh Frydenberg, why shoot the messenger? In this case, she has laid out, as you pointed out, that the vastly greater numbers of children in detention were under the Labor government's period. That's actually in the report. No one's disputing that. So why shoot the messenger? And because Tony Abbott said today, you're quite right, the government's lost confidence in Professor Triggs. He repeated it. He wants her out of that job, isn't that right?
Well, there's been no inducement
but he wants her out of that job. Is that right or not?
Well, we haven't asked her to leave, and it's as simple as that.
Can I just ask you, if you don't have confidence in her to do that job, why was she offered another international post?
Well, she wasn't offered another international job.
Well, is that true? Because that doesn't seem to be what Julie Bishop is saying. Certainly, she says an international posting was discussed.
No, she said an international role was discussed, and then, the question was who raised that. And I
what was the
there.
international role you were thinking of? Exile?
The issue is about the children. It's not for me about the messenger. But there are real questions as to why this report was not done when it peaked at nearly 2,000. And the result of our policies, effective as they are, unpopular in some quarters that they may be, is that we have effectively stopped the boats and children are no longer drowning at sea. That's the reality.
Andrew Leigh, I've got to put this to you. In spite of encouragement in my earpiece to move on, which we should, so keep it brief. Obviously, the Labor Party's position in this is that in government you allowed more than 2,000, well over 2,000 children to be detained in offshore and onshore detention. A previous member of this panel, one of your front benchers, Catherine King, appear to be quite ashamed of that record. Are you?
Well, Tony, like Josh, I think that one child in detention is too many. But the question from Lachlan was fundamentally...
Well, what about 2,000 plus?
Clearly we need to get children out of detention. But the question that came from Lachlan was about Gillian Triggs. And I'm old enough to remember a conservative tradition that valued the independence of the public service. When Labor was in government, Gillian Triggs challenged federal Labor legislation in the High Court and won. You didn't hear Labor then coming out and attacking Gillian Triggs. We respected her independent role. And what's really striking about this is the Abbott government seems never to have seen an expert that they don't want to silence. Gillian Triggs is an incredibly eminent scholar, whether you agree or disagree with her, and no one can read that report and not be profoundly moved.
And were you moved, as Catherine King was, to be ashamed of your own party's role in this?
I don't want children in detention. I also don't want children drowning at sea. And these are the challenges that we face as trying to craft asylum seeker policy.
OK, let's move on. Our next question is rather different. It's from Erin Gordon.
After the Sydney siege, we were all heartened to see the I'll Ride With You campaign receive such widespread support. However, I would like to ask the panel, who would ride with us, the Australian Jews, if we were to travel in particular areas of Sydney in our religious clothing? Anti-Semitic attacks have risen 35% in the past year, and physical incidents 200%. Why is there this precedent, and yet we have received no widespread support from the general public? Is it not alarming to the public that the hashtag Hitler was right trended worldwide last year?
Miriam Margolyes.
People don't like Jews. It's not comfortable to say that, and it's not comfortable to hear it, but I believe it to be true. After the Holocaust, it was not fashionable or possible to be anti-Semitic because of the horrors that Jews experienced during the Holocaust. But because of the actions of the State of Israel and the appalling treatment of the Israelis towards the Palestinians, and the settlements that have been built in contravention of the United Nations rulings, and the support that has been given by American Jews and Australian Jews to what is going on in Israel. Anti-Semitism has again reared its horrific, ugly head, and anti-Semitism is as unacceptable as anti-Muslim feeling.
I'm just going to go back to our questioner. I mean, do you accept that response? I mean, there appears to be blame levelled on the State of Israel for the rise in anti-Semitism.
I mean, Israel and Judaism, they are interlinked, but they're also separate things. Not every Jew supports everything that Israel does. But why should we still face some anti-Semitism that's going on in Australia, not in Israel? Why is that an acceptable level? Where is our I'll Ride With You campaign? Just because of the incidence of a group of people in another country.
I think you're right to be furious about it, And I would be, as a Jew and as a non-Zionist Jew. I am shocked that there are anti-Semitic outbursts, but it hasn't got to the level that it did in France, where people were killed. Remember that. And we have to just keep fighting about it and demand that we are given the respect that all citizens should enjoy and a sense of safety that all citizens should enjoy. But you ask me why, and I think that is the reason. I think it's because of Israel.
Can I just ask you a sort of logical follow-up question? Is the rise, in your opinion, is the rise in Islamophobia related to what happens in some Arab countries?
I've no doubt that it is, because these murderous bastards, the terrible things that they are doing, of course people are going to react in the way that they do. And just the same as an ordinary person would be horrified if they saw what goes on in Gaza and in Palestine. It is unacceptable. And when you know that something is morally unacceptable, you have to do something about it, not to the level of murder. That is not acceptable.
Josh Frydenberg.
I'm worried about attacks on Muslims just as I am worried about attacks on Jews. But I don't think that the rise in anti-Semitism is about Israel, as Miriam puts it. I mean, the Jews were expelled from England in the 13th century, expelled from Spain in the 14th century. You've had pogroms in the 17th, 18th and 19th century through the Ukraine and Russia. And of course, we had the Holocaust, which was the biggest extermination of a people. So this issue has been around well before the state of Israel. Now, people do conflate Israeli policies, and I won't agree with everything that Israel does, but I also will defend its ability to secure itself against some very hostile neighbours. And so I think there's a real dark cloud of anti-Semitism. I don't see it in Australia as bad as it is in Europe. And we've seen it with attacks and killings at schools, at synagogues, from Copenhagen to Paris and elsewhere. And it is a great concern. And I'm pleased, I must say, Tony, that European leaders, civilian and secular leaders, are speaking out against anti-Semitism. And recently at the Auschwitz memorial service for the 70th anniversary of its liberation, there was an unprecedented number of European leaders, from Francois Hollande to the German president to the Polish president, who all turned up to actually send a message, not just about the atrocities of the Second World War, but to say never again. And they were saying never again against a backdrop of rising anti-Semitism in Europe. OK,
so what do you say to the suggestion from our questioner that the hashtag Hitler was right trended worldwide last year, and what do you see as being behind that?
Well, in Europe there were lots of demonstrations where it said gas the Jews, whether it was in France, whether it was in Holland, and even, dare I say it, some of the messages and the placards that were held up here in Australia during really anti-Israel, very violent anti-Israel protests were seen to be believed. So what is driving it? I think there is a lot of hate media that's coming out of the Middle East. People are being taught very young that Israel is always the source of all bad in that part of the world, when we're seeing now the greatest victims of ISIL being Muslims themselves, when we're seeing Syria burn, when we're seeing Egypt under military rule, when we're seeing Libya go disintegrate as a state. Who are the biggest victims of all this? They're Muslims, and it's got nothing to do with Israel.
Jamila, I'll just get you to reflect on a questioner asked at the beginning about the Ride With Me campaign, and asked the question, would anyone ride with religious Jews if they went in religious clothing into parts of Sydney?
Yeah, sure. 86 tram in Melbourne. But I think part of it is also about the media and what the media is like and the story the media decides to tell. And at the moment, when Islamic terror is something that is at the forefront of everyone's minds, when there are response campaigns like the I'll Ride With Me, the media jumps on those stories. And I know we certainly did at Mamamia. I went, oh gosh, some good news. I want to tell that story. And I think the anti-Semitic attacks, which have been on the rise in Australia, have gotten less press because there's less stories to associate them with in the broader press. And that doesn't mean those stories don't deserve to be told, and it doesn't mean that those what's happening online isn't just as hurtful. The other thing I'd say is that just like on the internet, don't listen. Don't read the comments, don't think about it. There's something about the veil of anonymity that the internet gives people that brings out the very worst in humanity, but it can also bring out the very best. And I think you've just got to make the decision not to read the very worst.
Andrew Leigh.
Erin, I'm really sorry for the hate that you feel you've experienced. That must be an awful feeling. There's, I think, been a rise in anti-Semitism and as well as Islamophobia. And Jamila's highlighted very importantly the way in which social media plays a role in that. I don't think people have a right to be bigots, and I think the protections that the Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act have provided for 20 years are an important part of ensuring a civilised conversation. What we have to protect ourselves against extremism is in some sense our values, and it goes back to Ray's question at the start about egalitarianism. That notion that who we are in Australians comes not through our toughness but through our love, our ability to look after the most vulnerable, to recognise the strength and diversity. That's not a unique Australian value, but when we do it well, no one else does it as well as us. I think about that as a moment in the Sydney Olympics in 2000 when someone's standing on Central Station and they start singing that song, "It's late and I'm tired and I want to go home." And everyone across the platforms takes it up, and soon all of Central Station is singing together. And there's those moments. Australia at our best is unbeatable in our egalitarian shared values, our pride in the fact that apart from Indigenous Australians, we're all the child of a migrant or a migrant themselves. I'm married to a migrant. And that's a value that we need to cherish, to treasure, but to realise how easily it can be lost. And it can be lost when we rescind into fear, into this idea that we're in a hateful world and we have to hunker down. And it can be gained when we build those bridges across communities and have those conversations that transcend ethnicities and religion. You know, when you think back to the 1950s, I remember my dad saying, he looks through a picture of his school class and he could tell you all the kids that were Catholic or Protestant. And as I said before, he was the son of a Methodist minister. He married another person within his church. Right now, my kids wouldn't know who in their class is Christian or is Protestant or Catholic. That Protestant-Catholic divide doesn't matter anymore in Australia. And I'd love to think that as we go on, those religious divides between Christians and Muslims and Jews and the racial differences won't matter any longer, won't be barriers that stand between us, but it'll be differences whose strength we draw upon to say to the hate mongers, we're better than you because this is who we are.
Trisha, I'll bring you in, and I guess amid all the optimism, we probably should reflect on the fact that the same country that did those good things you're talking about also produced the Cronulla riots. Yes. Yeah.
I think the Cronulla riots are actually a good example of, I think, where racism comes from, and that's fundamentally from hatred. I don't think that it was a good example of multicultural Australia. I know that it was something I felt uncomfortable about for many years as being, visibly different. I don't know, though, that I suppose I'm sceptical of the idea that legislation like 18C has a real impact on things like that. I think that the kind of fear that Erin was discussing, the kind of fear that I know Jamila has felt and as she has written about before, the kind of fear I have felt is something that only our fellow Australians can kind of smooth away. I think that's something that Australia needs to work on a bit better, and I would like to see that.
I would like to say, Jews in Australia have made a huge contribution to Australia. Music, particularly, for example, in Sydney, would not exist almost without the Hungarian Jews who came here and and have done such great things and made concerts possible. But I would like to see that the Jews in Australia make an attempt to influence the government of Israel not to bomb hospitals and children in Palestine and innocent people. If Australians saw that not all Jews behave in the way that the Israelis are doing, maybe there wouldn't be this anti-Semitism. And let's make absolutely clear, anti-Semitism is a rotten thing. It's an ignorant, stupid, horrible thing, as is anti-Muslim feeling. They have to be together.
OK, we'll change tack completely, and we have a question from Lynn Connolly.
Trisha Jar and Andrew Leigh's research papers show there's no credible evidence to support smaller class sizes or university-trained educators for better outcomes for children, and in this case, in childcare. But approximately 70% of centres face viability issues due to expensive regulations pushing up costs and fees for families. Considering their research, can the panel justify Labor's push for ratio changes and higher qualifications and the Coalition's decision not to fund them?
We'll start with Andrew Leigh.
Well, Lynn, thanks very much for the question. The work that I did as an academic with Chikako Yamauchi actually found that having smaller groups made a difference. And that's the result that I see when I drop my 2-year-old off at the early childhood centre that he attends now and that his 2 older brothers attended. And it's one of the things that they've taught me, that childcare isn't babysitting, it's part of the education spectrum. And just as we'd expect highly trained teachers to do a better job, it's true in early childhood too. You know, one of the funny things is kids who play with water are learning physics skills. Kids who work in groups are learning about psychology. We're learning so much from neuroscience about what it is to be a great early childhood educator. And that's, I think, illustrating that this isn't simply a debate about babysitting. This is a debate about how we make sure that these precious young people get the resources they need for the early learning. And, you know, I see in my own childcare, the early childhood centre that my 2-year-old attends, simple things they've taught me. When you're changing a nappy, sing a song to the baby. So I always try and sing a song when I'm changing a nappy these days. Wouldn't have got that, but for a great, well-trained early childhood educator.
Trisha.
I'm sorry, Andrew, but your own research suggests, firstly, on ratios, your own research said that the only impact from staff-to-child ratios was when you had 6 carers to 10 children. Now, I don't think anybody would think that was economical. So at some point, we need to discuss marginal benefits for cost investment. Secondly, although I don't know that you've written any papers on this specifically, your other research and your review of the literature, such as the work of James Heckman and the like, has made it quite clear that the kind of early childhood demonstration programs that have shown to have like really great benefits for disadvantaged children simply do not accrue to the same scale when we're talking about your average Australian child. So I don't know that you can talk about the neuroscience being, I suppose, being I don't know that you can talk about the neuroscience being somehow without question when it comes to its impact on every single child, and more importantly...
So, Trisha, can I just quickly interrupt just for a moment, just to sort of see, just test the boundaries of what you're saying. Do you think it's better to have more economical, larger classes and less effort go into doing more than just child minding, more than simply... child minding, I suppose, is the best description.
Well, firstly, group sizes and staff-to-child ratios are slightly different. A group size will be the amount of children in a childcare centre, whereas staff-to-child ratio is about the number of children that one staff member is responsible for. I do think that when we're talking about the childcare system in a broad sense, so we're talking about the childcare system that parents access to be able to go to work, it should really be about ensuring that the child is safe and happy and well looked after so the parents can go to work. I don't know.
So high-value educators not an issue as far as you're concerned?
Well, it depends on what we mean by higher value educator. All the research evidence seems to suggest that the most beneficial thing for kids is having a positive relationship with the carer. Now, the question has always been what is the most reliable predictor of a positive relationship with the children? And in this case, the evidence doesn't seem to stack up that diplomas and early childhood teachers and certificate 3s and 4s are necessary for that relationship.
Okay.
Your own research, Andrew, in fact, showed that there was no link between staff qualifications.
Andrew, I know you're dying to jump in and sort of explain what your research actually said or nuance, and I'll come back to you on that. But I want to hear the government's about to announce a childcare policy, and you're listening to a debate here, and really it's a debate about the level of care, about the type of care, about the level of education of the carers and the cost. Where are you going to fall philosophically in this debate?
Well, we're going to be guided to some degree by the Productivity Commission's work, and they've just put out a report, and a lot of those views have been expressed tonight. We do have a problem in childcare. There are 165,000 Australian parents who want to go to work but can't because they can't get affordable or accessible childcare. And childcare went up 50% under the Labor government. And this is despite the Australian government trebling over the last decade its expenditure on childcare. So it's now $7 billion a year and rising it up.
Actually, because subsidies always drive fee increases. That's something we have to accept.
But the problem is we've got a lack of affordable and accessible childcare. So we are very interested in what the Productivity Commission has just reported. They've talked about a sliding scale of a new subsidy where you'd actually incentivise lower income families to get into the workforce. Because what's driving all of this, of course, is getting the proper care for the children, but also building female workforce participation. The Grattan Institute...
can I just say, I mean, I think a lot of people would agree on the value of childcare. We're now talking about the nature of it and what your policy will be. And actually our questioners from the Childcare Network, I think, of providers. Lynn wants to jump in. She's got a hand up. Go ahead.
Look, Scott Morrison has said that he agrees with the qualifications and the ratios and no intentions of changing anything in the National Quality Framework. So if the federal government does not have the money to fund these expensive ratio and qualification changes, considering affordability is a massive issue for families, Josh, what will you do to persuade Scott Morrison to pressure the states to reverse or to defer the changes until your federal government has the money to fund them for families?
Well, you're right to say it involves the states. This whole national quality framework has been worked on for a number of years with the states and the federal government, so it's not easy to change. When we're putting out our families policy ahead of the budget, you will see us deal with the comprehensive range of issues because we understand that it's an affordability and accessibility issue, and it goes right to the heart of female workforce participation. Just to tell you this, if Australia could lift the percentage of women in the workforce by 6 points, where Canada currently is, it would be a $25 billion annual boost to the Australian economy.
So look, this raises the obvious question, and you're the Assistant Treasurer, so you probably know the answer. Are you prepared to spend a lot more money on childcare because you get that benefit down the track, or because it's going to hurt the budget in the short term, are you not going to do that?
Well, we are spending more money. And
how much more money?
Well, we're spending $7 billion today, and you'll find out with our family package how much more going forward.
But hold on, in the last budget there was $1 billion taken out of childcare by the coalition.
No, extra money has gone into childcare. It's growing significantly.
But there's been a huge number of programs that have been defunded while you've just had an increase around the rebate as more people access them.
No, we are putting more and more money every year, and it's trebled over the last decade. And we understand that this is a serious issue, hence it goes right to female workforce participation, and that's why we're doing a families package.
But you did have an election promise related to the paid parental leave scheme. That was, of course, at least going to be partly...
It's not dead yet.
Let's say 2013.
Well, first of all, broken promise, yes?
Well, again, it was we were unable to deliver.
Unable to deliver. OK, let's just quickly work out where the money was going to come from for that one. Part of it was from a levy on business. You're going to shift that levy over to pay to childcare?
Well, we
paid for childcare?
we haven't made any announcements about that levy, which
I
was
know you haven't. That's why people want to know the answer.
Well, as you know, that levy was to fall upon the 3,000 of the largest companies. We're also putting out a small business package where we've said there will be a tax cut for small business. There's been a lot of speculation.
But will there be a tax cut and a tax increase that you're going to call a levy?
We're not about tax increases, I can tell you, because...
But when you have a tax increase, you call it a levy.
In terms of the paid parental leave scheme?
Yes.
Because that was for a temporary period.
OK, so briefly, you're not going to shift that levy over to pay for childcare?
You'll see the announcements in due course.
It sounds like you're saying no, though.
Well, it sounds like you're interpreting what I'm trying to say.
You just said you're not going to put any more tax burden on business, and of course they want to know whether this is going to be one of the tax burdens they're going to have to pay, a levy, to pay for childcare. They want to know that now.
Well, we're not about to increase taxes, but we are about greater funding for childcare.
And are taxes and levies the same thing?
No, they're different. And they're different from a fee as well.
So, oh, the question's got a hand up again, probably wants to qualify that. Go ahead.
The Perry Preschool report also says that for every dollar spent on an early childhood education, $7 is saved throughout the life of the child. And I think also you may be spending over $7 billion on early learning, however, and childcare. The mothers who are going to work while we care for their children are actually paying about $6 billion in tax. So we're pretty cost neutral.
Okay.
And what we're doing is educating the children.
Yeah. On the cost-neutral question, we have to take that as a comment because we've got one question to go to. We've got a couple of minutes left, and we're going to go to our final question, which is from Elaine Jontek.
Miriam, last time you were on Q&A, it was 2012, Julia Gillard was our Prime Minister, who you said you liked, and you found that she was fascinating. Your comment on Bob Hawke was that he was just ravishing. Just wondering if you have any similar, or what sort of thoughts you would have about our current Prime Minister.
And remember, you can't use ravishing or fascinating.
I think he's a tit.
I guess as a one...
I think you're supposed to say 10 points to Hufflepuff.
Josh Frydenberg, if you had one word to describe Tony and we should leave out the one that some of your colleagues at least would probably give him, and that is doomed.
I think that's I mean, to be honest, Tony, you just say that. He's our elected Prime Minister of this country.
No, I said that's what some of your colleagues in the Liberal Party said.
Well, you give me their names and addresses, OK? But the point is, Tony Abbott, if you want to have one word, it's decent. He's a decent person. And the reason, just to elaborate that, because obviously I'm in a minority here. This is a guy who, well before he ventured into politics, was a hard-working member of his local community as an SES volunteer, as a surf lifesaver. He doesn't go out and do that stuff with a camera in tow. He's a father of 3 beautiful girls. He's a happily married husband, and he's a hard worker in this top job.
So just to come back to what I mentioned earlier, and it's a serious point, because how do you explain the fact then that a group of MPs, and to use your own words, dislike him so much that even if he delivered the Gettysburg Address or won the Nobel Prize, they'd still want to get rid of him?
I'd say that's politics, and I'd say that you would find, I mean, after the 6 years of Labor, we saw Rudd and Gillard and the backroom leaks that, you know, may I say, some of my own colleagues are now engaging in.
Is it over?
What's that?
Is it over?
In terms of the destabilisation of the leadership? Probably not. But can Tony Abbott survive and prosper? I think he can.
Jamila?
Do I think Tony Abbott's decent?
No, really. I suppose the question that arose is what's the word you might use to describe, and ravishing and fascinating have been used up.
Time limited with a hyphen. Does that count? Look, to what Josh just said then, I have no doubt Tony Abbott is a decent guy, but I don't want a decent guy as my Prime Minister. I want someone who is phenomenal. I want one of the best brains in the country. I want someone who can communicate a message and what they want to do, who has a vision for Australia's future. It's awesome that he's a great volunteer in the local electorate. He should go back and do some more of that.
Trisha.
I only have one thing to say, and that is that the tit is a lovely bird.
Yes, fair enough. Andrew.
I mean, I think the events of the last few weeks have been best summed up by that metaphor of the cabinet ministers around Tony Abbott being like a group of 7-year-olds trying to work out how to deal with a brown snake. And the real problem is that even if they do manage to change the leadership, the policies are going to live on. Malcolm Turnbull is wedded to cutting foreign aid. He's committed to a GP tax. He's committed to raising the cost of universities. He's committed to every measure, he says, in that last unfair budget, which took $1.10 from the poorest single parents while making rich singles better off. It's the wrong recipe for an egalitarian Australia, those sorts of issues that we've been talking about.
It wasn't really an
here.
invitation for a political speech, Chad.
But that was his Gettysburg. But you're asking how I feel about Tony Abbott.
I know, but the Gettysburg Address had 672 words and he was bound to exceed that. How many, sorry?
I think it was 260.
Yeah, sorry, you're
I
absolutely
think
right.
Josh is moving an extension there, isn't he, Tony?
You worked that out, isn't it? 272?
Something like
I can't
that.
remember. Anyway, I'm sorry, that's all we have time for. Write in and tell us how many words were in the Gettysburg Address. Please thank our panel. Miriam Margolyes, Josh Frydenberg, Jamila, Rizvi, Trisha Jar and Andrew Leigh. Thank you. Now, next Monday, Annabelle Crabb will be hosting Q&A as we celebrate the 40th anniversary of International Women's Day in collaboration with the All About Women Festival. Joining her will be Australia's Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, pioneer feminist Germaine Greer, self-described bad feminist Roxane Gay, the CEO of Australian retailer Best & Less, Holly Kramer, and engineer and founder of Youth Without Borders, Yasmin Abdel-Majid. And remember, Q&A will be on ABC TV as usual, but simulcast live on iView instead of News 24. I'll be back in 2 weeks' time. See you then.